Okay, we are still on where do we go from here? Chaos and Community, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And we're picking up still in the first chapter of the book, where the probably the most important part to me was where he was explaining how the civil rights movement was necessary and where it did accomplish things. To restate why that was so important is because we're taught that the civil rights movement gave people rights, gave black people rights. It was made to balance the imbalance created by slavery and segregation and racism and economic disenfranchisement. When we later found out that it did not, it disproportionately did not benefit black people. It benefited women. It benefited people with alternative lifestyles. And Lyndon B. Johnson held up that legislation specifically for it to include that because they could still reroute money in the white community if they used those groups. If they said, okay, yeah, black people, but women who are not a minority, they're actually the physical majority, the literal majority, and the people of alternate lifestyles is more white people of alternate lifestyles because it's disproportionately more white people. So this was a way to keep the money in the white community, but appearing as though they were acquiescing to the demands of the black community. But so I am guilty of being a person for years that said that the civil rights movement failed. And this is where Dr. King is correcting that. And it begins on page 13. It says the argument that the Negro made no progress in the decade of turbulent effort resets the demonstrable facts that paint an ugly picture of stagnation in the many areas, included income levels, housing, and schools. But from a deeper perspective, a different conclusion emerges. The struggles of the past decade were not national in scope. They were Southern. And we covered that in the last video where he was saying that they could not move forward as long as that dramatic disparity was in place. So that was number one, why phase one had to be what it was and where it was. Then, pretty much, if we didn't do these things and find out what we found out, we never would have known or proved that this was an economic problem, which in stating that he says the amazing transformation took place in one decade, the struggle after in one decade of struggle after 10 decades, 100 years of virtual total disenfranchisement. When he's talking about 10 decades, he's talking about the 100 years. If you go 100 years back from 1965 or 67, you're going to be at 1867, where we know we were getting the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. So the Reconstruction Amendments. And obviously the ending of chattel slavery. The Negro almost seemed invisible all the way up until this time, the decade of change. The Negro stood up and confronted his opposer. That's the first thing that needs to happen. So that alone makes the civil rights movement a success. So as I teach this in the future, that is what I have to lead with. The first thing you have to do is confront the issue. White folks wasn't saying nothing. Black folks wasn't saying nothing. And all of a sudden, somebody had to say something. So that was where I was wrong, 100. That's why we got to read Dr. King's book. See, we're learning what the publishing companies, which, just to be honest, most of them, if the publishing company is black, the distribution company is not. So the books that we get, if we don't read exactly what Dr. King wrote, what we know of Dr. King is what the dominant culture or white people have told us about Dr. King. Not what he said, but unfortunately, we don't read his books. I don't understand it. It said, this decade, the Negro changed. The decade of change, the Negro stood up and confronted his opposer. He faced the bullies and the guns, the dogs, the tear gas, and he put them squarely before the vicious mobs and moved with strength and dignity toward them and decisively defeated them. For more than a century of slavery and another century of segregation, Negroes did not find mass unity, nor could they mount actions. The American brand of servitude tore them apart and held them in a paralyzed solitude. And again, what does this communication that Dr. King is saying? A scholar, an intellectual. He's saying the same thing that was being written at the same time by other intellectuals and scholars, which was the Kerner Report. So we have two completely different sources with two completely different agendas saying the same thing. And unfortunately, our colleges, our elementary schools, our junior highs, and our high schools are not teaching about the Kerner Report. They're telling you about Dr. King, but how many of Dr. King's books are on our reading list in high school? Why are we not reading the autobiography of Malcolm X? Why are we not reading Up from Slavery? Why are we not reading Prophet of Freedom, though that is a very thick book, but another book about Frederick Douglass? If we have an entire month for Black scholarship, no, we have Black History Month where we talk about it, but not where we have any intellectual diving. He, meaning the Negro, no longer would endure. He would resist and win. So that was another thing. The first thing is that Black people had to challenge their opposer. And then they had to get some kind of victory. They had to get some kind of victory to build any kind of momentum. Because before that was segregation and before that was slavery. So this was huge in the Black image, the Black mindset, the Black view, the Black reality. He still had the age-old capacity to live in hunger and want, but now he banished these as his lifelong companions. He could tolerate humiliation and scorn, but now he armed himself with dignity, resistance, and his adversary tasted gall and defeat. Remember, these kids that were out there were kids that were at Fisk. These were kids that were at Tuskegee. These were kids that were at Howard. These were kids that were at your historically Black colleges and universities. The Black Panthers were started by college kids. Those weren't thugs. Those weren't hooligans. These were the intellectual minds, the young intellectual minds of that day, of the 60s. So these were the thinkers that were consciously opposing an issue that was hundreds of years old, older than the United States. They powerfully integrated within. This was the victory that had to precede all other gains. I disagree, but I understand. I understand what I think Dr. King's view was on this integration. Integration meant to him equality means I can be right next to you. And if I'm next to you, you can't hurt me without hurting you. I just wish, and I think this is where Dr. King was kind of going. There are other scholars that are pointing out that after the death of Malcolm X, that Dr. King visited the grave of Marcus Garvey. And subsequent to that visit, his speaking, this book, The Economic Empowerment, really began to sound a little more Pan-Africanist. There's a book that I'm waiting to come back to me. It's about Booker T. Washington being a Pan-Africanist. And this was something that I had just intuitively channeled. It's like, oh, this dude understands against what Dr. King is saying as far as the integration. This guy is saying, there's actually an advantage to us in this structure based on who I know these people are. They're never going to treat us right. They're never going to they don't give up power within themselves, let alone to someone else. There's actually a greater opportunity for us within this model, because there is more harm for us if we integrate. That's what Booker T. Washington knew. But then you had W.E.B. Du Bois coming after him. And W.E.B. Du Bois was the scholarly accepted mind who unfortunately had the light-skinned superiority complex. And the talented 10th just happened to be light-skinned black people. So the fact that he lived so much longer than Booker T. Washington, and he was great in his own right, we ended up getting more black history, because you got to know W.B. Du Bois's relationship to the NAACP, and the NAACP was the authority of everything black during that time. Affected our education, affected our culture, affected our communication, affected our marketing, affected our understanding our reality. The NAACP, and you have to understand W.B. Du Bois's relationship with the NAACP. So that really influenced the scholars subsequent. Dr. King. Less as much with Malcolm X, because his parents were Garveyites. So that was already in his head. Which, funny enough, Elijah Muhammad was a Garveyite and used Garvey's Black Star Line setup in constructing the Nation of Islam, which was extremely successful at one point. From the issues of personal dignity, they now advance to program and impinge upon the basic system of social economic control. At this level, Negro programs go beyond race and deal with poverty. Now we're moving to Pan-Africanism or economics. And that's a different deal. And that is really at the core of what Garvey understood. But then Dr. King goes on in the next few pages. In the past year, nonviolent direct action has been pronounced for the 10th time dead. New tactics have proposed to replace it. The Black Power slogan was described as a doctrine that reached Negroes' hearts with a deep an appeal that no alternative method could withstand its magnetic force. Rioting as described as the new Negro form of action that evoked results when disciplined demonstration sputtered out against implacable opposition. Now, at this point, Dr. King is going into how the entire Black Power movement started. He was there. He was a part of it. He was actually used to elevate it. We will move into that part, but that is the key to getting this book started off. Is why was the civil rights movement a success? Now, that's hard for a lot of people to grasp because a lot of people don't know that it wasn't. That what we were told it did not do. Now, in getting information, once I found out it didn't do what I was told it did, I thought it did nothing. But when you read Dr. King's words, then you go, okay, that's what it did. It didn't do this. It did do this. Now, what else happened next? What was the second phase? Dr. King's second phase was, okay, now we're going to talk about economic empowerment, which is where he was going to do a tent city in front of the White House, and nobody was going to leave until they had jobs. And that was going to be a multicultural movement. It was a movement against poverty. It was a war on poverty as opposed to a war on drugs. Like Tupac said, instead of having a war on poverty, you'd rather have a war on drugs so the police can bother me. So we'll move to the Black Power movement in the next video.